afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this session. I'll start with a thank you to Jane King, who has put this session together. We met under interesting circumstances last when I was chairing the conference over the road, and she was coordinating the Extinction Rebellion action outside. And we both bonded over the serious concerns that we should all have about climate change. And we're here to talk about the Climate Change and Ecological Emergency Bill this afternoon. Simplicity, we're going to refer to now on as the bill. As a bit of background, this is a draft piece of legislation which has a second reading in Parliament in March. The aim of the bill is to make laws committing us to a radical agenda to make sure that we stay within our commitments that we've made the Paris Agreement to stop global warming by rising by more than 5 degrees above what they would have been in pre-industrial times. Great panel to discuss this about the bill in a bit more detail, and it's a particularly timely sort of juncture to be discussing this because we have the COP26 in November, which is the UN Climate Conference taking place in Glasgow. With our current behaviour, we have no way of meeting the commitment that we've made. So urgent action is needed, and that's why the bill is so important. My role here is a student because I run a conventional farming business. I supply supermarkets in the UK and Europe, and I suppose that I represent the status quo of how things are done. But people like me and businesses like mine are going to have to change a lot if the bill comes through. So I'm here to learn about that and what actions need to be taken. The three panellists are Charles Secret, a former director of Friends of the Earth and an advisor to the bill. He can tell us about it in more detail. Hi, Charles. Dave Coulson, who's a scientist from the University of Sussex. He also advised on the bill, and he's a leading in understanding of agroecology. And our third panellist is Vicky Hurd, who's the farming policy specialist from Sustain, and she's been working in sustainable food production and the supply chain generally for more years than her appearance suggests to us. So I'm going to start by handing over to Charles, who's going to tell us a bit more about the bill.
Matt, thanks very much indeed. Now let's see if I can get this up so that it's full screen. No.
So if you go back down to that lower right-hand side, it's the icon that looks like a projector, 2 over from there. To the right. That one, yep, you got it. And if anyone is experiencing an echo on the panelist side, just make sure you only have one tab of StreamYard open, and closing down the other ones will eliminate that echo.
Okay, great. So hopefully you can all see on your screens the full slide. And now we're going to start on just summarising what the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill is all about. Well, as you can see from this first slide, we're taking a joined-up approach. Good old sustainability, looking at everything in the round and interconnected. And what the bill does, this draft legislation, it focuses on the urgency, the science, target, fairness, and accountability. The bill emphasizes the interconnected nature of the climate and the natural world. In other words, that we can't decarbonize the economy if we don't stop destroying nature. And if we don't decarbonize and we don't protect and restore nature, we won't prevent Earth's systems from breaking down. So why do we need this draft legislation in this country, in the United Kingdom, probably also elsewhere? Well, As is common in many countries, neither government nor parliament in the UK are acting with enough urgency. And what the bill does is it enshrines into law a commitment to reduce emissions to net zero urgently as science demands, so that we make our contribution to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. In other words, in line with the Paris Agreement that is about implementing the Climate Change Convention. And our government's target of net zero by 2050 is just way too late. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made it quite clear that the planet, that the community of nations, need to halve our carbon and greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to have a chance of reaching net zero by 2050. But actually, that just gives us a 50-50 chance of meeting 1.5 degrees centigrade. In other words, it's no better than the toss of a coin. Another reason why we need this bill is about fairness, intergovernmental, international, and intergenerational fairness. So the bill, once law, will make government fully accountable for all the UK's domestic emissions, including aviation and shipping, which currently aren't counted by our government. It makes government and UK companies responsible for all emissions resulting throughout our domestic and international supply chains. In other words, our entire carbon footprint. But what it also does is it removes a loophole, one that our government has been relying on, of using unproven negative emissions technologies as an excuse to delay or limit cutting emissions from burning fossil fuels and other sources. We need the bill for accountability reasons, for holding the government accountable, not just for emissions reductions, but also for the protection and restoration of the United Kingdom's critical natural capital, with a focus on biodiversity, on soils, and natural carbon sinks. And as with carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, it makes government and UK companies responsible for stopping the damage caused to nature at home and abroad through domestic and international supply chains, the supply chains that deliver the goods that we consume in our country. So it accounts for the UK's entire environmental as well as emissions footprint. But we don't just leave these critical decisions up to government. In fact, as we can all tell, if we just allowed politicians to make all these decisions, we're more likely to end up in a mess than in solutions, or in the best possible solutions. So there is a component in the bill to strengthen deliberative democracy, to allow for a representative citizens' assembly to be established, where government, parliament, scientists, and citizens work together to create the emergency strategy that achieves the bill's objectives, but to do that in a constitutionally sound way that doesn't underwrite or undermine parliamentary sovereignty. So the Citizens' Assembly is actually a mechanism to empower MPs to make bold decisions based on the best of evidence and avoid the polarizing constraints of party politics. And yet it allows regular people, citizens, to have a real say in shaping the pathways to that fair and just transition for a zero carbon society and a thriving natural world. But the campaign model is just as important, we think, as the bill itself. So this isn't about building a campaign around experts or campaign organizations alone. It's about building a broad alliance across all sections of society, working together for the common good. So that's about grassroots organizations, about regular citizens, about non-governmental organizations, businesses, MPs and political leaders, both at the national level and at a local level, involving local authorities and councils, faith groups and churches, unions. We have regional alliances setting up in constituencies across the country. And there are many, including ones in Oxfordshire and Birmingham and Bristol, towns and cities in our country where these local alliances that mirror the national alliances coming together to push the bill forward. It's about engaging MPs and political leaders directly so that they can't duck their responsibilities. And it's about winning the argument, using science and evidence to demonstrate that the bill makes life better. It's about creating stronger economies that deliver what people need to improve their quality of life and their standard of living. And that model of the campaign is a critical part of making the bill a success and bringing it into law sooner rather than later. So there you go. Hope that was clear. So Matt, I think over to you.
Sorry, I think that's £10 for charity for not unmuting myself. Thank you very much, Charles. One question that we've just had is who's behind presenting the bill to Parliament? Explain that one to us, please.
Okay, it is that alliance and coalition of interest that I referenced in the last slide. It's very much about building coalitions at a national and a local level to take the arguments and the evidence forward, both to Parliament as a whole, nationally, and to every single MP from every single party at a constituency level. So this is about ensuring that MPs listen to what voters and their constituents want. And that's a critical part of helping Parliament and helping individual MPs go back to their leaders and say, we need to do this because not only because of the evidence and because of the science behind the bill, but because our constituents want it. This is how parliamentary democracy can work.
Thank you very much. And a second question that's just come is, what stage is the bill at? And this is coming up for a second reading of a private member's bill. So thank you, Charles. We've now got a presentation from each of our three panelists who are going to tell us a little bit about what the bill will mean in the future. And if it's okay, I'm going to start with Charles again, who's going to tell us a little bit about that before we go on to Dave and then Vicky. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. So just summarizing quickly from the presentation, it's about meeting the warming imperative of 1.5 degrees centigrade and not letting warming go higher than that. It's about implementing the Paris Agreement alongside critical nature protection and restoration across all supply chains. It's about covering total consumption emissions and not doing what we in the UK and other industrial countries do, which is offshoring our responsibility for emission reductions to other countries. And it's also about getting our COP26 positioning right as a government, as a nation. The Conference of Parties that's going to be happening in November at the end of this year, when nations from across the world are coming together to demonstrate how they are going to contribute to making Paris work and ensuring we don't go above 1.5 degrees centigrade heating collectively. The bill is a legal imperative for all sectors, for energy, for transportation, for materials use, for buildings, for construction, for manufacturing, for retailing, for lifestyles, as well as for land use and farming, and about linking the scientific realities of looming Earth system breakdown, the climate crisis, emission reductions, and nature biodiversity and sink restoration at home and abroad. It's a holistic approach, and one we think is very convincing. What we know is that we cannot prevent, either in the UK or elsewhere, climate and ecological breakdown without transformational changes to national diets in developed countries like the UK, the food we eat, and how it is produced. But transforming most food and farming systems is indeed a global imperative for all nations. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Special Report on Land Use has shown that the extent of change required to curb emissions, to protect nature, to restore natural carbon sinks, and to mitigate against temperature rises of 1.5 degrees and beyond, as well as adapt to avoid the worst impacts of global heating, such as extreme weather events, droughts, flooding, food shortages, and social unrest, is something for all of us to do. Now, in the UK, part of that land use reform means looking at how we farm land. And around 3/4 of UK's agricultural land is currently used for livestock, for pasture, 65% of our land is pasture, or as crops for feed for livestock, as well as for supplies for commodity markets. Only a tiny fraction of our land actually feeds people directly. The majority of our foodstuffs are imported from abroad. But our supply chains cause very wide natural damage, ecosystem destruction. In overseas countries, especially in tropical forest regions, from the production of foods like palm oil, soya, and cheap beef. And at home, leading to the clearance of critical carbon sinks, as well as wildlife-rich woodlands, meadows, wetlands, and peat bogs, and the loss of wild species dependent on those habitats. So for the UK, the transformation of farming has to include shifts to growing a much higher percentage of our food in our own country, and particularly of fruits and vegetables, as well as helping us move rapidly towards diverse cropping, mixed farming, and agroecological production, and away from intensive monoculture systems dependent on the heavy use of fossil fuels and polluting, poisonous, and climate warming synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, which again are primarily geared to animal feeds and support for intensive meat production. So we have a big opportunity to create robust and resilient local food economies that bring producers and consumers together in shorter supply chains with clearly linked environmental, social, and economic benefits. It's whole system transformation from planting to plate, from the type of agriculture and food production to the national diet. And that's a huge task, shifting primarily to a plant-based diet where meats are a much smaller component of what we eat. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, exhortation and lecturing on what's good for me doesn't really work very well, or not in the short term anyway. And that's probably true for most people, whether it's about extolling the environmental health benefits of not doing so. That's not enough. It's likely to be counterproductive, but certainly too slow. And what we need, what consumers need, what producers need, what farmers need, are very different market rules and signals, incentives and rewards, not just penalties. So what we want the bill to be backed up by fair regulation and fair taxes and spending that reward and help farmers, the food industry, and consumer accelerate these essential shifts. As far as regulatory frameworks are concerned, we need very high environmental and food quality standards. But we also need regulatory frameworks over genetic modification and gene splicing in order to prevent patent and corporate ownership of critical food varieties and products, because that simply consolidates industrial producer and manufacturer control over farming and food supplies and variety. We need fiscal frameworks, taxation and spending that accelerate these changes. Carbon taxation is going to be a critical part of that, making the polluters pay and using the price of carbon, heavy farming activities and chemicals to move production and use away from them. But as you raise carbon or raise the prices of those foods, you have a carbon benefit because the prices of low carbon foods and production systems lower. So there are rewards based in this as well as penalties. And a key part is to also use those tax revenues wisely and re-spend them to further drive the take-up of agroecological solutions, nature conservation, and the restoration of critical habitats and carbon sinks, along with encouraging more diverse farm ownership, especially supporting family-sized farms, young farmers, and mixed farming systems. We need subsidies. Subsidies, government money used to support agriculture, has traditionally been used to drive the intensification of production and the clearance of critical wildlife habitats, along with the widespread loss of rare and once common wildflowers, insects, birds, and animals. And while we're beginning now in this country to move to that direction, big questions remain of how effective that's going to be. And I know Vicky is going to be talking about this a little later on. Time is our most powerful constraint. And COP26 in November is our critical summit. We're rapidly moving towards Earth system limits and the threat of runaway climate change because our collective emission reductions have been so weak. Humanity is already crossing 4 of the 9 critical planetary boundaries that govern Earth system interactions over climate change, the loss of biosphere integrity, land system change, and biogeochemical cycles, especially the overuse of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers. Going over just one of these boundaries globally significantly increases the risk of catastrophic economic, social, and ecological change at continental scales. Science tells us that the only sensible and fair way forward is for global heating to be kept to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So this year is the critical year for nations to get their act together and agree powerful and robust nationally determined contributions to collectively meet our Paris obligations. And it's really important that the UK, as joint host, takes that lead by implementing the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. And hopefully for all of those in the audience from other countries, the bill can provide some suggestions for you about how you can take up the cause and ensure that your government comes into COP26 with the strongest possible position to make sure that Paris becomes a global collective success. Thanks very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm now going to hand over to Dave, who's going to tell us a little bit about his work on the bill. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Matt. I'm going to talk more broadly about kind of global food production to start with. I think one of the challenges we face is that people have kind of come to accept industrial farming as the norm, as you know, we look at our countryside with big fields with monocultures of crops treated endlessly with fertilizers and lots of different pesticides. And we think that's how the countryside ought to look. But of course, it didn't always look like that. It's a relatively new phenomenon. And I think also a problem we have is that people perhaps implicitly or without really thinking about it, they accept that industrial farming is the only way we can feed the world. That, you know, we all know the human population has grown a lot and is going to grow more. There may be 10, 11, 12 billion of us before too long, and we need to feed everybody, clearly. So I think many people think that the only way we could possibly do that is through more intensive farming. But actually, the reality is clear that it isn't sustainable. And actually, in the future, people will starve if we carry on with this approach to food production for a number of reasons. And you're probably familiar with all of them. Firstly, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with food production globally amount to about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, is a similar amount to that produced by energy production, which is where everyone thinks emissions come primarily from. Clearly, it's not sustainable. We have to reduce the emissions associated with food production. But there are other issues too. So, for example, a recent estimate suggests that global farming is leading to soil erosion, and that the loss of in the region of 24 billion tons of soil a year. And if you think about it, that's more than 3 tons each for every person on the planet every year being lost. And clearly, if we don't have soil, then we're not going to be able to grow food in the future. And finally, of course, the biggest driver of biodiversity collapse around the world is farming, the way we now farm and loss of habitat to farming. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction event. Species are going extinct now faster than they have for 65 million years since the dinosaurs were wiped out. And extinction rates are currently at least 100 times and accelerating to perhaps 1,000 times the average historic rate, which quite terrifyingly means that while we're having this 1-hour session today, probably something somewhere will go extinct. But actually extinctions is just the kind of the final end of the loss of bioabundance. Most species haven't yet gone extinct, but what has happened, and what worries me more, I think, than extinctions is how wildlife has become much less common than it used to be. So one recent study estimated that the total number of vertebrates on the planet has fallen by 68% since 1970. So 2/3 of all life on Earth essentially has disappeared since I was 5 years old. Absolutely terrifying. But what's most galling about this is it isn't necessary. People think that we have to produce all this food or someone will starve, but actually if you look at total calorie production, we grow about 3 times as many calories as we actually need to feed everybody. But we waste about 1/3 of them, and obviously that's ridiculous. But then another third of the crops we grow are fed to animals, and we've just heard from Charles a little more about that. I mean, globally, nearly 80% of all farmland is used for meat production, which is just staggeringly inefficient as a way of feeding people, and I think we all know that. Sorry, losing my thread today. And also, overconsumption. In the Western world, we now eat way too much, and we have an epidemic of obesity, which is costing the economy huge amounts of money, largely due to the ill health associated with poor diets and overeating. There were recent estimates suggested that just in the UK, obesity is costing the economy £27 billion a year, and it's rapidly accelerating. So we waste food, we eat way too much meat, we eat way too much, we eat too much of the wrong kind of food. And a big driver of that is that we grow the wrong kinds of food. If you look globally, we grow far too much grain and far too much oil and not enough fruit and vegetables. So there aren't enough fruit and vegetables to give everyone in the world a healthy diet, but there's more than enough grain and oil, which is why our diets are based largely on consuming starchy, fatty foods, pizzas, pastas, pastries, cakes, biscuits, and so on, which is really bad for us. So we need to be growing food that is healthy for us. And if we could reduce food waste and overconsumption and meat consumption, then we wouldn't need anywhere near as much farmland globally. And I'm a big fan of E.O. Wilson's idea that we should try to set aside half the earth for nature. It may sound ridiculously optimistic, but actually, if you just look at the figures, it would be perfectly possible to free up vast areas of farmland. What you then do with that is a matter of huge debate, but we could rewild, we could use that land for carbon capture, for biodiversity, or whatever. It could be an amazing opportunity, but it will obviously be quite challenging to achieve. Anyway, to come back to focus more specifically on farming, I've said what I think is wrong with global farming. Then what should farming look like? Well, first and foremost, it has to be sustainable, which it clearly isn't at present. But if you can't carry on doing it indefinitely into the future, we shouldn't be doing it at all. So farming needs to look after soil health. Rather than damaging soils, leading to soil erosion and carbon loss into the atmosphere, it needs to be capturing soils. It needs to be focused on looking after the organisms that live in soil, which means not ploughing too often, not using too much fertilizer, and not exposing soil organisms to pesticides over and over again. More broadly, we need a farming system that works with nature rather than against it, that encourages the natural enemies to control crop pests rather than trying to kill them with pesticides, that looks after the pollinators that are absolutely vital to pollination of our crops. And of course, a farming system that produces food that is good for us, enough food, but the right kinds of food, all the fruits and veg that currently, both globally and in the UK, we don't produce anywhere near enough of. And the funny thing is, all of this is completely possible. It's actually quite easy to grow food in a way that works with nature, that looks after the soil. In fact, many of us do it in our gardens. If you look at vegetable patches or allotments, they can be surprisingly productive at the same time as being rich in biodiversity and having soils that are full of carbon. Something we've been studying is allotment food production. And a really good allotmenter can get 35 tons of healthy fruit and veg per year per hectare. That's scaling up because an individual allotment's smaller than that. But that's a lot of zero food miles, zero packaging fruit and veg. And at the same time, there was an interesting study from Bristol University a couple of years ago that showed that allotments are the richest places for biodiversity in urban areas, better than urban nature reserves or parks or even gardens. Food production and nature do not have to be mutually exclusive in the way they've come to be in modern farming. They can actually go hand in hand. And it doesn't, obviously we can't feed the world with allotments, but there are similar kinds of farming using the same kinds of principles. Things like agroforestry, permaculture, biodynamic farming. Biodynamics is often regarded as a bit sort of kooky because they have some elements of almost magic involved. They make potions and so on, but 99% of what they do is incredibly sensible. They don't use pesticides. They focus on soil health, on attracting pollinators, on companion planting to control pests and so on. Makes absolute sense, and they produce lots of food in a way that's completely sustainable and supports biodiversity at the same time. So it can be done. It's actually not that difficult. We already know how to do it, but we have to change society so that it actually happens. And one way we can do that is by bottom up, by persuading people to change the food they eat, the food they buy, to support local food producers, to buy seasonal produce, and that kind of thing, to not eat too much meat, of course. But we also really, really need help from the top. We need changes to policy if we're really going to achieve substantial change to the whole food system. And this, of course, is where the CEE Bill comes in and why we're trying to urge everyone to support it. Okay, thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was great. And now Vicky is going to give us her perspective now.
Thank you very much, Matt. And it's great to hear those two earlier presentations because I don't have to repeat what they were talking about, which is fantastic. So I'm head of farming at Sustain, which is an alliance of over 100 groups and organisations all working on food and farming. So we have a key vested interest in seeing this bill debated and its measures taken forward. So I'm just going to make 3 key points about the bill specifically on because I think we need to talk about that in terms of how we can help it go forward. So the 3 things are about putting nature and climate side by side, on the drivers for better land management, and on the global versus local footprint. So starting with the first one, what is core about this bill is it's putting climate and ecology side by side. I've been in so many meetings over the years where land-based solutions, for instance, to climate, such as large-scale energy crops from maize, or energy forests, which is a phrase I find deeply disturbing, they've been jumped on without consideration for what they do for the ecology, for justice of the communities working on the land, and so on. So the central focus of this bill on nature-based solutions is critical, and how it will address the economic paradigms that drive things in the wrong direction. Without limits, there is no limit to nature, our current economic system things. So this bill will be starting to challenge the economic issues that Charles talked about as well, the fiscal measures, all the things that we need to change in order to recognise that we've got limits. And we need to avoid greenwashing, such as the practice of land grabs abroad to offset domestic carbon intensive activities, you know, finding land abroad to grow trees so we can continue to do what we want to do here. Totally unethical. Or landowners here encouraged to grow trees without consideration of what that means for the tenants or for the soils or for food production. Bioenergy for power generation without or with carbon capture and storage. A big boost is being given by this government for that kind of bioenergy production. It's a great concern if it displaces our food production or our nature-rich areas or rich areas overseas. So we need to avoid those kind of greenwashing things. And the stringent provisions in this bill on negative emission technology called NETs, negative emission technology, they're very welcome. When we don't yet have that kind of legislative oversight of those kind of technologies, we're just going free hell for leather on them. So we need robust and benchmark standards to calculate the ecosystem health as a core demand in this bill is critical. That's what we'll be doing, ecosystem health and climate measures. If we want to move away from seeing biodiversity as a useful add-on, maybe, in climate measures, rather than of equal importance, it needs to go side by side. And in order to do that, we do need to have a clear process of developing a land use strategy to decide what the land in the UK is for and the land we use overseas, what it's for and how we manage it. Without that kind of strategy, which is often a political decision, we won't get anywhere. So that's got to be part of this discussion. My second point, what drives better farming and land use? And Charles and Dave did talk about this. Industrial nations like the UK have left farming to corporate objectives largely. This has made them super efficient and centralised, producing commodities. It means decisions on how we manage the land are often in the control of distant boardrooms and for the benefit of shareholders. And regulation has been weakened and it continues to be weakened. But that's no longer feasible or safe. We can't put this precious resource of the land in those hands anymore. So governments need to start to drive the changes. I've been working on the Agriculture Bill, which is now an Agriculture Act. It's a big piece of legislation changing how we support farmers in the UK. One of the policy measures from that, paying money to farmers for provision of public goods or benefits that won't be paid by the market, that's a big, exciting change. And everybody's got very excited about this over the last 3 years. And in England, it's going to be called the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And it's a very complex development of measures to help farmers, to reward farmers to deliver public goods. And it could go some way to help drive what we need. It really could. But, and there are big buts with this, there's too little accountability. And Charles talked about accountability in the bill. It's essential. I saw how duties were pushed back on by this government in the Ag Bill. So by duties, I mean in the bill, in legislation where it says the government shall, so that word shall is or must, were pushed aside by the government to put in the word may. And that gives us no accountability that the government will do these things. And the parliamentarians, opposition, won't be able to keep government accountable. There's also the risk that we'll see atomised green farming measures in isolation in a sea of increased intensification. So good practice, loads of bad practice, as farmers cope with the low prices and increased competition from trade deals. And there's no regulatory baseline as yet. And I haven't finished with the buts. The budget, what about the budget for making sure we can incentivise farmers in the transition in the right way, wherever they are now, making sure no farmer is left behind, they are incentivised. Is there going to be a budget for that? That is critical against all the pressures that farmers are up against. They need the right incentives to make the transition. And there are loads of risks involved in that transition. How many farms, how much landscape and diversity will be lost if we don't take care, we don't have the debates, we don't have the measures that we need. And this CEE bill will put a duty urgently with a timetable on government to deliver new food systems, land use being central to climate and nature recovery. The government will be accountable in a way they're not now, and in a way that I fear, although it's not set yet, that the Environment Bill, which is also a new piece of legislation, that won't deliver what's needed on both fronts. It's still in play. There's still a lot to do on the Environment Bill, but I'm really worried that won't deliver. So my third point is about our global feed, fuel, food and fibre footprint. It's all fours we get from the UK, but also we derive from the global land. The environments, we import so much, from cotton t-shirts to chicken parts. Putting a commitment to cover that, not only covering domestic emissions and ecological impact into the UK law, but our global impact and emissions. That's great. That needs debate. That's essential what the bill does. So a post-Brexit, global Britain hosting the COP this year in Glasgow in December means we need to show what's needed, not what is currently acceptable to those in power and to the big influencers. This bill is a key part of demonstrating that. And the debate that we have on the bill in the run up to the COP is critical. The emphasis should be on building low impact, resilient farm and food systems and supply chain infrastructure to build new routes to market. Alternative supply chains are needed so that agroecological farmers get the rewards and feedback they need from their customer base. And more fresh and less processed food should be growing and availability not reduced, as is currently the case as heavily processed foods fill the shelves. That's all bad for nature and climate. And the feedback and rewards from the current supply chains, like supermarkets, big agribusiness, is not good enough to help farmers transition to the new farming. Farmers get about 8% of the total money that we spend in the UK on food. That's crazy. How can they possibly get the right kind of farming, treat their animals and their workers right? We need agroecological processes with high welfare, diversification, nature areas, integrated pest management, and so on and so forth, everything Dave was talking about. And the idea that we need to get big and get intensive and use whatever tools and chemicals we can or get out is not what we need right now. We need a new direction of travel. And research shows, and if anybody was in the session yesterday on the new IDRI research, we can feed ourselves perfectly well in the UK. We'll need to waste less food, lose less food in transit, and we'll need to eat differently, but we can feed ourselves. The research is clear, as Dave also said. And we need regulation too on the current supply chain so they play fair, so we don't lose farmers in the interim and they can retain decent incomes, farm sustainably, etc. So the debate on this bill is vital. The Citizens' Assembly bit is brilliant. Must have it as the triumvirate of power, should be citizens, government and parliament. So that's critical. And I encourage you to support the bill, get involved, look on the website and do everything you can to influence MPs, your MP. They are there to represent you. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Vicky. Yeah, 3 excellent and very interesting presentations. And the questions have been flooding in. I've made a lot of notes, and I'm trying to pull them together in a way that sort of makes sense. We've got nearly 15 minutes now for discussion, and then we're moving over to Zoom to carry on the conversation after that. So if I can start off, a lot of the questions that have been coming through, the majority of them, have been from very passionate graziers, people who like rearing meat on grassland, and they're advocating that as a great way of sequestering carbon in the soil. But what all three of you have indicated is that diets have to move away from meat. And so if we look at how much land in the UK is currently used for grazing, and the fact that a lot of it isn't suitable for anything else, how do you see the transition working to diets with less meat in? How can we allow farmers to move away from livestock production and towards veg production? And who'd like to take the point first? Vicky? Yeah.
Yeah, I've been campaigning on this since I think 2006, and on particularly on livestock issues. And actually, I did present a bill called the Sustainable Livestock Bill back in 2009 with a lot of other people. And it's sad that that didn't get through, because if it had, we would now have farmers really supported in making the changes they need to and starting to move away from factory farming, which uses so much land in terms of grain and proteins, soya from Amazon, etc., to feed factory farms. What you're talking about is the graziers, and I know some brilliant pasture-based farming systems and organic livestock systems, and there is absolutely a way we can do this. I think there will need to be less but better. We need to be paying more, not necessarily customers, but maybe the intermediaries, and have closer supply chains, direct sales, so there's nobody making big money in the middle. So farmers still get what they need to farm less and maybe different breeds. There's a big role here for looking at different breeds to do things differently. Dual purpose breeds, where you can get meat and dairy, and loads of things. And I'm hearing a lot from the industry at the moment in terms of how they're doing things differently. And agroforestry, mixed swards, not going for very monoculture grass that needs a lot of fertilizers. There's lots of knowledge out there of farmers doing things differently and having more mixed farming systems, or mixed farming systems in a region. It's not about every farm going mixed, as somebody was saying yesterday. It's about making sure the nutrients are used within a system, and we don't have to have so many animals. In fact, in some places a lot less, but we can have more trees, not necessarily afforestation, but agroforestry, mixing animals with trees and with crops and so on. That will give us the diversity we need, which is good for the environment and for our health. I better stop there. I could go on forever. Sorry.
Thank you. Charles, yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Vicky has said, and to say that, I think one of the critical things is that eating less meat doesn't mean eating no meat. And there is a real role for the type of sustainable meat production that we've all been referring to in helping not just different types of farming system, but helping nature. I mean, many of our grassland species, for example, depend on either sheep or cattle in particular. I'm thinking of Halvergate Marshes in the Norfolk Broads now, and the type of insects and birds and flowers work very well. They are dependent on that type of low-intensive meat production. And so I think that, my diet is, I don't know, probably 90% vegetarian. But vegetarians and vegans need to think, vegans in particular, need to think very carefully about how some of their dietary requirements, like for almond milk, for example, or for all sorts of other things, actually encourage environmental destruction elsewhere. So we're talking about less, not no meat. And the type of, subsidies and tax systems that we're talking about absolutely support that type of low-intensive animal rearing and husbandry right across the meat train, whether it's to do with poultry or to do with beef or to do with pork or what have you. So those farmers will be supported under the system.
Thank you. And Dave, what's your perspective? And also, perhaps, could you tell us a bit about what great vegetable production would look like in the UK if we wanted more local vegetables for local markets? How would that be produced?
Yeah, just suddenly spotted I was muted. So I haven't that much to add on the meat production front to what Vicky and Charles have said. I mean, my point when I raised this was that, if you look globally, we eat way too much meat, and a lot of it is supported by unsustainable practices. You know, we're burning down the Amazon to have free-range cattle, which is just a staggeringly stupid thing to do. The large majority of meat is produced in intensive indoor units, fed grain produced intensively or soybean produced intensively elsewhere, and also often with dubious animal welfare standards. And you know, those are the things that we need to address, not someone you know, farming regeneratively with low density animal numbers in the west of Britain. So as Charles said, basically it's about less meat, not no meat. I endlessly have rows with my eldest son who's vegan about this, but that's for I won't rehash those now. In terms of vegetable production, I mean, it's actually astonishing how much can be produced in quite small areas. I mentioned this with allotmenting, and if you do some quick back of an envelope calculations, you'd only need, now let me get this figure right, about 200,000 hectares of vegetable and fruit production to provide the entire vegetable and fruit demand of the UK. That's about, I think it's about 5% of UK arable land. That's all you would need to be self-sufficient in fruit and veg. And yet right now we import 70% of our fruit and veg. And we even, I mean, it's ridiculous. You know, we import apples from New Zealand. Now that may not be a bad thing actually, if you're doing it in May when the apples have come freshly from the trees in New Zealand. But you can get apples from New Zealand in UK supermarkets in October when they're not in season in New Zealand. In the UK, it's just insane. It makes no sense at all. So the whole system is bizarre and nuts. So we could easily be self-sufficient. Of course, we'd still want to import some produce that we can't grow in the UK. You know, I don't suppose we can wean everyone off bananas and avocados and the like. And actually, so long as food can be transported over land or sea rather than by air, the carbon costs associated with food transport are not that high. So I personally don't think we should be trying to be 100% self-sufficient in the UK. I think that's a bit daft. But we should, if we had enough fruit and vegetable production, we could match what we import with what we export to neighbouring countries. And you know, there's nothing stopping us from doing this other than changing essentially changing the subsidy system to support fruit and veg production more than we do at present.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, we're drawing into the last minute or two. The time's gone quickly, and it's obviously a much bigger subject than we can cover, and that everyone will be able to move across to Zoom with us. And finally, I was just going to ask Charles, for anybody who's watching this who wants to do something more, how should they engage with their local MPs, particularly bearing in mind that there are no Tories who have supported this? What should they be asking their MPs to do? And does anyone have any suggestions of further reading matter? Thank you.
Well, I mean, that in itself is a pretty big question, so I'm going to keep it very short. I'd urge everybody at home and abroad to look at the Bill website. Just Google Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill Alliance or CEE Bill Alliance, and the website will come up. And through the website, we can find links to your local communities, your local activist groups, and all the information and the briefing that you need as a citizen, as a voter, as a constituent in this country to be able to take up the argument and evidence with your MP, but also to find other people in the places that you live who are doing the same thing, so that you can become part of the coalition as well. That this is a collective enterprise, a collective campaign. It's a big community that the Alliance has become locally and nationally. And in most towns and cities now, we have the local alliances building up, and all the details are there on the website. And the final thing that I'd say is, all too often, those of us who aren't campaigners full-time or even part-time think, oh my God, I've got to leave everything to my representative, to my MP. That's actually a hollowing out of democracy. An MP is a human being, even if they're ideologically driven. And all it takes is a letter, a surgery visit once the pandemic is over, a telephone call, an email to make your point of view clear, because the MP is there to represent you. That's what a parliamentary democracy is all about. And the campaign is about mobilizing, organizing, and inspiring people coming together locally and nationally to bring about this change. We've done this so many times before with other private members' bill, where we've overturned much bigger majorities than the current Conservative government enjoys with 80. So this is totally winnable if we all join in.
Thank you. We're still waiting for the Zoom link of where we all have to next to be showing up in a second or two. In the meantime, Vicky, is there anything that you would point the delegates joining us? What would you point them towards as reading matter and as further actions that they can take?
Yeah, there's a lot. As Charles said, it is a really great website. Lots of different things you can do and get involved, and lots of information. I mean, look at the sustainweb.org website. You've got a lot of blogs and publications. For instance, people have been asking about land use strategy, and I just wrote a report last year looking at that, and many others have as well, called Green and Pressured Land. Because that is key and will be part of what this bill needs to affect, what we decide land for. And we've also written quite a lot up about the Elms and Agriculture Bill, Environmental Land Management Scheme. So, there is a lot out there, and lots of members of Sustain, like RSPB, National Trust, and many others are really usefully putting up blogs that give quick summaries and links to wider research. I did mention the IDRI research yesterday, that there's a summary of a really good European one on the Soil Association website, looking at how agroecology can actually feed us. They've done some really detailed studies, and it shows how it can feed us, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and tackle biodiversity loss, and still leave some food for exports. So look at IDRI, agroecological farming reports, and that would be a really useful thing to look at as well. And there's a lot of books out now. Read Dave's books; they're very good.
Thank you. It looks like we should have been getting the Zoom link from something that we were sent in the past. I thought earlier that it was going to show up on the here it is. So we'll thank you. Thank you very much, Becky. We'll now gravitate across to Zoom, if you all have that link. The other three, Vicky, Charles, Dave, do you have that link on the right-hand side? Excellent. Well, we'll take a 2-minute break.
Hang on a second, I don't. When you say the right-hand side, where?
There's a column to one side.
I've got the chat. Is it in the chat?
Yes, if you have a look at the bottom there.
Scroll down, Charles. Scroll down
to the bottom.
Yeah, got it. Okay, perfect. Yeah.
We'll take a 2-minute comfort break. For those of you not joining us at the Zoom, thank you very much for joining in, and thank you to our 3 speakers and Jane for organising. See you on Zoom.